I died on a Tuesday. I know that seems like an odd detail to fix on, but when everything else you thought you knew turns out to be wrong, you hold tight to the small factual things. The day of the week, the color of the sky through the windshield in the last second, before the other car came through the intersection. A pale October blue, the kind of sky that looks freshly washed, the specific sound a body makes when physics decides it's done with you. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a dull, conclusive thud that is somehow the most ordinary noise you have ever heard. I died on a Tuesday in October, on a road I had driven 400 times. I was 31 years old. I was wearing my good coat, because I had been to my mother's church that morning, and she still checks whether I dress properly, and I had been trying, as I always try when I visit, to be the version of myself that doesn't disappoint her. I tell you all of this so you understand who arrived. Not a soldier, not a diplomat, not anyone with training or authority or a useful skill set for what came next. Just a woman who went to church because she loved her mother, and who had spent 31 years believing, in a low-grade everyday way, that the universe was organized around something benevolent, that there was, underneath all the noise and the damage and the ordinariness of living, a structure that held. A record that was kept. A place you went when the road was done, and it was. The word I would have used before was good. I would have said it was good. I believed that with the same comfortable certainty I had about most things I'd never had to test. I tell you this so, will you understand the specific quality of the shock when I got there and found that the record existed? All right, and that it was being used against us. The first thing I noticed was the light. It was wrong, not dark. If anything, too bright, a flat institutional brightness like a government building at noon, a brightness with no warmth in it that illuminated everything and made nothing feel illuminated. The kind of light that exists to prevent shadows rather than to create anything useful. The second thing I noticed was the sound, which was also wrong. The low constant hum of something enormous processing, something that had been processing for longer than I could comprehend, running as steadily as a factory that has been running so long the workers no longer hear it. The third thing I noticed was the line. There was a line. Of course there was a line. Thousands of souls stood in a queue that stretched as far as I could see in both directions, in a hall whose ceiling was so high, it disappeared into that flat white light, in front of rows of counters staffed by tall, pale figures in gray robes who moved with the specific economy of people who have been doing the same task for an unimaginable length of time, and have developed strong, settled opinions about efficiency and very little patience for anyone who interrupts the flow. I stood at the end of the line, at one end at least, though I wasn't certain there was an end in either direction, and I thought, this is it then. This is what 31 years of Sunday mornings bought me. A queue in a building that looks like a motor vehicle bureau designed by someone who had been told, secondhand, what grandeur was supposed to feel like. I got in line. What else do you do? The woman ahead of me had died in her 70s, I guessed. White-haired, small, wearing a house dress and sensible shoes, with the slightly bewildered expression of someone who has just walked into a room expecting one thing and found another, and is still in the process of revising. She turned and looked at me with an expression I would come to recognize over the following hours as the universal expression of the newly arrived. A kind of wide-eyed recalibration, a fundamental revision of every internal model of reality, happening in real time, visible on the face like a weather system moving through. You'd think it would be different, she said. Different how? She looked at the hall, the counters, the gray-robed figures with their flat eyes and their precise, unhurried, unstoppable movements. Warmer, she said. I didn't have an answer for that. We didn't talk much after. You don't in the queue. You stand, and you wait, and you watch the counters, and what you start to understand, as the line moves and the minutes or hours or whatever units of time applied in this place accumulated, was that the people at the counters were not welcoming anyone. They were processing. Processing is a different thing from welcoming. Processing is what you do to something you own. They took a name. They consulted a record that only they could see. They pointed in a direction, or they made a mark in a ledger, and the soul in front of them moved on or was moved on. And it happened with an absolute absence of ceremony. An absolute absence of any acknowledgement that the thing being processed had recently been a person with a full and particular life, with a mother who checked whether they were dressed properly, and an October sky they had looked at for the last time through a windshield. I got to the counter. The figure behind it was perhaps 7 feet tall, pale as old marble, with features that were almost human if you looked straight on, but which, if your attention drifted to the periphery, seemed to be arranged in ways that the human face doesn't quite allow. A geometry that the eye kept sliding off, not uncomfortable, just not quite right, like a word in a language you half know that you can't fully parse. Long-fingered hands, that were a shade of gray, I did not have a word for, that were not unkind, but were entirely without personal investment. The way a librarian's face is, without personal investment, in the title you're returning. Name, it said. Not a question of procedure, I told it my name. There was a pause while it consulted the record, not a physical record, nothing I could see, just a stillness in the figure's attention that suggested it was reading something I didn't have access to. Then it spoke again. Origin, Earth. Tertiary jurisdiction, Class 4 soul, faith, nominal. Operational compliance, above average. Another pause. No special designation. Standard processing. What does standard processing mean? It means you proceed to the assigned sector. Your record will be maintained here. You are registered. You are filed. Filed. Correct. And what happens in the assigned sector? The gray eyes came to rest on me, with the patience of something very old looking at something very young. You are maintained in the record. Your existence in the system is confirmed and logged. And then, that is the extent of the process at this stage. That's it? I'm filed and maintained. That is correct. I stood there for a moment longer than was probably wise. I was looking at the flat gray eyes of this vast old thing, and I was thinking about 31 years of Sunday mornings, and the pale October sky, and I was thinking that the specific feeling I had in my chest was not grief exactly, not anger exactly, but something in the category of refusal. Dramatic, not performative. Just a settled, quiet, bone-deep no. I'd like to speak to someone in authority, I said. The pause that followed this was different from the others. Not longer, if anything, briefer. Just differently textured. The way a room goes, quiet differently, depending on what kind of thing you've just said in it. The figure behind the counter looked at me, really looked at me, maybe for the first time, in a way that was not quite administrative interest, but was something other than the flat processing gaze. That is not a service, that is offered. At this stage, it said. Then I'd like it noted that I'm requesting it anyway. I moved on. The soul behind me stepped forward. The figure at the counter was already looking past me, returning to the procedure, but I had the distinct and uncomfortable impression. And I held this impression close as I walked in the indicated direction, that something had been noted in a way that had nothing to do with the ledger. The assigned sector was a long corridor, and then a larger space, and then a series of spaces that were not quite rooms and not quite outdoors. A kind of vast interior geography with no apparent logic to its dimensions, where souls moved in the flat white light and the processing hum never stopped, and I walked through it for what felt like a long time, and I watched. What I watched was this. The celestial realm. That is what I came to call it, though I suspected the figures in gray robes had their own terminology, dense with administrative precision and entirely uninterested in how it landed on the people being administered. Was enormous. It was unmistakably grand in its architecture, in the scale of its halls and its light and its apparent organization. It had the bones of something that had been built with genuine intention and considerable love for the work, but it was also undeniably damaged. Not damaged the way a building falls into damage through neglect. Damaged the way something is damaged when it has been through a sustained and serious conflict and has not fully recovered, and has decided, at some administrative level, not to acknowledge that fact. The walls in some places were cracked in ways that had been plastered over, but not repaired. The plaster a slightly different color, slightly smoother than the original surface, visible once you knew to look. The light in some corridors was wrong, flickering, dimmer, casting shadows in ways that the flat institutional light elsewhere did not. There were sections I was steered around, redirected from by the gray-robed figures stationed at junctions, directed always toward the functioning areas, the areas where the processing continued without interruption. I noticed that the redirections happened before I asked to go anywhere. The figures at the junctions were not responding to my choices. They were anticipating them, steering me along pathways that had been determined without my input. Someone had fought here. The evidence was in the walls, in the light, in the shape of the redirections. Someone had fought here, seriously and at significant cost, and the realm was still counting the cost, and covering the count, and filing it somewhere that incoming souls were not directed toward. I was still turning this over when I found the doubters. Didn't know that was what they called themselves. That came later. I found them because I heard a voice in a side passage I had no reason to take, except that I had the growing conviction that following the directions of the gray-robed figures was not serving my understanding. And I followed the voice because it was doing something I had not heard anyone else do in the realm. It was arguing. The voice belonged to a man I will call Jude. Not his name, or not entirely. It was close enough to what he told me his name was. And it fits him in the way that the right name fits a person you come to know well. You stop being able to imagine any other word for him. He was stocky, broad through the shoulders, with the specific kind of face that looks like it has been in arguments its entire existence, and considers this a reasonable way to spend an existence. Dark stubble, a scar across one eyebrow, the posture of a man who has never in his life stood in a room and assumed the authority in it was legitimate. He was arguing, in a low, fierce, contained voice with a taller man I will call Thomas, who was lean and dark-eyed and had the habit of pressing his fingertips to the scar on his forearm when he was thinking, which was constant. They stopped when they saw me. Jude looked at me with the evaluating look of a man who has learned, through long experience, to assess people quickly, because in his line of work, the cost of misjudging runs high. "How long have you been here?" he said. "Few hours, I think. You came in through the main hall." "Yes." "They give you a sector assignment?" "Yes." "You didn't go?" "No." He looked at Thomas. Something passed between them. The compressed exchange of two people who have been doing difficult work together long enough to conduct a full conversation in a glance. Then Jude looked back at me. "Come with us," he said, "or don't. If you have questions you want answered, we're further along on that problem than anyone else you're going to meet in this place." I went with them. There were 7 of us, in what Jude called the band, a word he deployed with the same dry awareness he deployed most words, as if he had considered all the options and chosen the least pretentious one available. The number fluctuated in the days that followed. I never learned the full history of any of them, and I have come to believe that was appropriate. Some histories belong to the people who lived them. Jude had been there longest. Thomas was the skeptic, the one who questioned every assumption, challenged every plan, interrogated every piece of information they gathered, including his own conclusions, and who was, for that reason, the most valuable person in any decision they made. When Thomas stopped pushing back, you paid attention. It meant he had found something solid. There was a woman I will call Mara, who was compact and precise in the way of someone trained to move through dangerous spaces efficiently. She had died in a war I did not recognize and moved through the realm's back passages with the same settled confidence she would have brought to a forward position, reading the terrain, identifying cover, noting the exits before she needed them. There were others. They had all found their way to the same refusal through different routes. And what bound them? The thing that made them a band rather than 7 separate grievances sharing a corridor was that each of them, at some independent point, had looked at the realm and said, internally and without coordination, no. They told me what they knew over time, in pieces, as we moved through the realm's back passages towards something they had been tracking for a long time. The realm had a governing body, the High Council. 13 members, ancient. The specific kind of ancient, that is no longer ancient in the way living things are ancient, but ancient in the way institutions are ancient. Settled into their own authority, the waste settles into a riverbank. Having forgotten that the river was there first, they had administered the transition of human souls since before the concept of human memory reached. And they had used that tenure to accumulate the convictions of all very old administrative bodies. that their authority was natural, that their methods were correct, that their procedures were the proper shape of reality, and that any soul who questioned the filing was a processing anomaly, rather than a person with a legitimate objection. The High Council had some time ago exiled the figure at the center of everything. Jude explained this carefully because he knew how it would land, and he was right about that.
The figure the rogue apostles.
Jude's word, said with the small, dry smile of a man who had made his peace with how absurd his circumstances were, had spent years searching for, was the one who had held genuine authority in the realm and refused to use it the way the council expected. The one who had walked through the processing halls and looked at the filing and said to the council's face, in the language of the administrative record itself, "This is not what this was built for." The one who had been designated, in the council's terminology, a structural irregularity, whose name had been struck from the record. Not deleted, because you cannot delete a record in a system that has been processing since the beginning, but suppressed, buried under procedural notation, reclassified into terms that meant nothing, filed in a location that required permissions the council had revoked and never reissued. His name they had exiled to the deep passages of the realm, behind sealed doors, behind 3 posted administrators, in a place that did not appear on any map distributed to incoming souls. "And if you find him?" I asked Jude on the second day of our movement through the back passages, sitting against a cracked wall in a corridor where the light flickered and the plaster repair above us was so thick you could see where the original damage had been deep. "We restore the record," Thomas said, from across the corridor, not looking up from the sequence he was working through in his head, fingers touching his forearm scar in the steady rhythm of his thinking. "We put the name back where it belongs. In the central registry, in the first position it was always supposed to occupy. The council built entire administrative apparatus on the assumptions that they could keep the name filed, that the suppression would hold indefinitely because they controlled the record and because souls came through the hall and got processed before they had a chance to ask anything. What does restoring the name do to the council?" Jude's small, dry smile. "The record is the source of their authority. The record says, this is how it is, this is who is filed, this is who is processed, this is the structure. The moment a name is in the record that contradicts the structure, a name with a designation the council cannot override, visible to every soul that comes through the hall, the record stops saying what the council needs it to say. And then they have to answer for the filing." I thought about this for a long time. We were moving again, Mara out front, reading the passage for the kind of attention that meant administrators had been through recently, and I was walking beside Thomas, and I was thinking about the walls, about the cracked plaster repairs, about the evidence in the structure of the realm that someone had fought here, and then fought, and the fight had been serious, and the realm had not fully recovered, and had decided, administratively, not to acknowledge that. "They were afraid," I said. Thomas glanced at me. "The council. They exiled him because they were afraid. You don't exile something that isn't a threat. You don't strike a name from the record unless the name destabilizes the record." All of this, I gestured at the cracked wall, the wrong light, the thick plaster over the old damage. This is what fear looks like when it has an administrative budget and a very long time to work with. "Yes," Thomas said. He was quiet for a moment. "The thing they couldn't solve, and still can't, is this. They exiled him, but they cannot exile the fact of him. Every soul that comes through the hall and gets filed, the filing works because the soul accepts it. The soul accepts it because they don't know there is anything else possible. But the possibility was always there. Put it there. Before they suppressed the name, before they sealed the passages, put the possibility into the structure of the realm itself, and you cannot file a possibility. You can cover it. You can post administrators at the junctions. You can redirect every incoming soul away from the corridors where the evidence shows. The possibility remains in the walls, in the weight of what the name meant, and every once in a while, a soul comes through the main hall and asks a question the filing procedure does not have an adequate response for. What kind of question? The kind you asked, he said, gave you the right. We moved for what felt like 3 days, though time in the realm was unreliable in ways I stopped trying to track. the administrators came at us, at 3 separate junctions. At 2 of those junctions we lost someone. I am not going to describe those encounters in tactical terms. The cost of that movement through those passages is real, and it was paid by specific people, and I will not minimize it by converting it into operational narrative. What I will say is that Mara moved the way she moved, and the rest of us followed, and that Thomas was wrong about one thing and right about everything else, and that Jude, in the worst moment of the 3rd junction, said something to the person we were losing that I could not hear and have never asked him to repeat. Kept moving. You keep moving. That is the specifically human thing, and I did not know it was specifically human until I was in a place that wasn't, and could feel the difference. The realm, up close and in its cracked back passages, was nothing like the institutional efficiency it presented from the front. Close, it was desperate. The scorch marks under the plaster, the sections of floor where the original stone had been replaced with something darker that didn't match, laid quickly without time for precision, the sealed doors with their posted administrators and their absent entries on every map. The realm had been cracked open, once by someone with the authority and the will to do it, and it had put itself back together badly, and covered the seams and continued process. And the processing looked, from the front of the hall, exactly like it had always looked, except for the walls. The original architect was not gone. Jude told me this. Sus. Quiet, and certain in a passage where the hum of the processing machinery was distant enough that we could hear each other without lowering our voices. The realm had been built for us, not built by us, built for us, by some things that intended it to be a place we came to, and found genuinely good, not processed and filed but known and held. The council had moved into it the way all very old institutions move into a space not built for them. Slowly, by increment, reclassifying and redefining, until the original purpose was buried under procedure. Until the place built for a specific welcome had become a system for efficient intake. The original architect was in the deep passages. Filing did not reach there. We found the place by the shape of what was missing. That was Jude's method. And it worked. You find exiled things by mapping the absences, the places where the record skips a beat, where the processing notation shows the seam of something that has been removed. He had been doing this for years. Thomas had verified the map 3 times and identified one error in Jude's reading and 2 places where the council had tried to introduce false absences to mislead exactly this kind of tracking. We went around both. The place itself was, I don't have language adequate to it. The realm's institutional light didn't reach there, but it wasn't dark. There was a different quality of presence, something that had nothing to do with administrative brightness, something older and considerably less interested in being institutional about anything. The walls were original, unpatched, and the cracks in them went deep, but the walls had not crumbled. The space had been sealed, but it had not been diminished. Feel the difference between those 2 things as soon as you stepped through the door Mara had opened. Sealed and diminished are not the same condition. The council had confused them. That confusion was the error at the heart of everything they had been doing for a very long time. He was there. I will not try to describe him with precision because I am certain the description would be wrong in every specific, and right only in the way that matters. He was present in a way that was different from the way the administrators were present. Not louder, not larger, not more dramatic, just more there. In the way that a true thing is more there than a filed thing. The way the room you grew up in is more there than a room in a building you walked through once. The weight of the actual behind it. He looked at the group of us, and he looked at me in particular. And there was something in that particular attention that I had no procedure for. And I think that was intentional. You've been causing trouble, he said. I've been asking questions, I said. That's what I said. There was something in his voice that was, not humor exactly, but in the neighborhood of humor, the way the light just before dawn is in the neighborhood of full light without being it yet. He looked at Jude, and something passed between them that was nothing like the administrative consultation I had been watching at counters for days. It was older and quieter, and entirely without procedure. Jude had spent years reconstructing the access protocol, the sequence of designations that would restore the suppressed record, put the name back in the central registry in its correct position, reopen the access that the council had revoked. Thomas had verified it 3 times and argued with Jude about 2 components, and been right about one of them, and acknowledged, with the particular grace of a man who is genuinely committed to being right rather than to having been right, that Jude's version of the other component was better. Mara held the passage while they ran it. What happened when it executed was quiet. That surprised me. I had expected something to show. Some physical consequence, some visible disruption in the realm's structure, some evidence legible to the senses. What happened instead was a sound very faint, like a large and well-made lock turning over after a long time in the same position. A sound in 2 parts, the resistance and then the release. And then a stillness. And then, from the direction of the processing halls, at a distance that should have made it inaudible, but did not, a sound I had not heard in all my time in the realm. Voices. Many of them arriving at their questions all at once, asking. Jude and the others moved into the passages with their own purposes. They had their own parts of the work, their own routes, tasks that had nothing to do with me and that I have never asked the full accounting of. Because it was not mine to ask. My job was different. My job was something I had apparently been noted for, in that first hour at the counter, in the specific act of standing in front of a filing system and saying, I would like it noted. I was the one who walked into the High Council's chamber. The chamber was the largest space I had seen in the realm, and in the way that the whole realm was grand. The curved ceiling high above, the tiered seating sweeping in a full circle around a central floor, the flat white light from somewhere above that touched everything with administrative clarity. The 13 members of the High Council in their seats, 11 that I could not fully look at directly without my vision doing something uncomfortable, 2 that looked nearly human in shape, if not in the quality of their attention. All 13 looking down at me from the tiered height of their positions, with the expression I had been looking at since I arrived. Not cruel, not unkind, simply settled in the conviction that the framework within which I was being evaluated was the only framework that existed. First among them occupied the center of the highest tier. I understood this not from any symbol but from the quality of its presence, which was the oldest and most settled thing in a room full of old and settled things. An oldness that had stopped being impressive and had become simply atmospheric, like weather, like the weight of a deep building pressing down through its foundations. You have violated 17 processing protocols, it said. Its voice had the specific quality of something that had never needed to raise itself to be heard, because the alternative to being heard had never, in its experience, been available. You have interfered with standard administrative procedures. You have facilitated unauthorized access to a suppressed designation. You have done this in company with individuals already designated processing irregularities, and you have been in direct contact with a classified exile. Yes, I said, this is an admission. It's a description of what happened. You understand that your record can be altered. I understand that you can make marks in your ledger, I said. I'm less certain that the marks are what you think they are. The quality of the silence changed. 10 very old things looked down at me from their tiered seats, and I looked back at all of them, and in the distance of the realm, not the processing distance, the other distance, the one that had been on silent for as long as the realm had been running. Something was continuing its quiet work, and the voices asking questions were moving through the passages in the way that water moves, finding every crack, seeing into every space the plaster hadn't reached, and nothing the council said in this chamber was going to stop it, because the name was back in the central record and the access was restored, and the filing had a crack in it that was going to widen every time a soul stood at a counter and asked, "Who gave you the right?" The first among them regarded me with its gray settled attention. "You will be exiled," it said, "from the record of the process dead. Your designation will be removed. You will be stricken from the filing. You will not exist in this system." "All right," I said. "I want to be careful about describing what happened next, because the easy version is wrong. The easy version is that the council erupted in outrage, that I delivered a speech, that there was a dramatic confrontation. None of that happened. What happened was silence. The specific silence of 13 very old administrative things encountering, Apparently for the first time in a very long time, a response they did not have a procedure for. I looked up at the first among them. "You can remove me from your system," I said. "I'm not your system. I was never your system. You filed me because I came through your door and stood in your line and didn't know I had any other option. But the filing was your action, not my nature. Striking me from your record doesn't strike me from anything that matters." I paused because I wanted the next part to land without speed. "You cannot administer what you don't own. You never owned us. You convinced us the filing was the whole story, and for a long time, the filing held because no one knew there was a story before the filing. But the record is open now, and the name is back in it, and every soul that walks through your hall from here forward walks into a realm where the original designation is accessible, where the full record exists, and where the question has an answer. You can exile me from your ledger. You cannot exile the question." I walked out. I did not storm out. I did not deliver the last line and turn with timing. I simply stopped talking because I had said what I had come to say, and I turned and walked across the central floor of the chamber toward the door, and in the time it took me to cross that floor, I heard nothing from the tiered seats above me. Order, no decree, no administrative response, no command to stop, no invocation of protocol, no mark in any ledger. Very old things that had processed human souls since before the concept of Tuesday existed, and not one of them issued a command. I have thought about this many times since. I have thought about what I was, walking across that floor, and what they were watching from their seats, and what it was they were actually encountering. And I think, not with certainty, but with the considered judgment of someone who has had time to turn it over, that it was not defiance. They had procedures for defiance. It was not argument. They had procedures for argument. What they were encountering, sitting in those tiered seats in their grand chamber in the flat white light, was a human being who did not accept the premise of their authority, not as a position, not as a philosophical stance. Just as a flat settled fact, the way you don't argue with gravity, you simply note that it is not the only thing operating. Record was restored. The name was in it. The voices asking questions were in the passages. Possibility that had always been in the walls of the realm, that the council had spent enormous energy suppressing, was now accessible to every soul that walked through the main hall. Not because we had told them anything, but because the weight of the restored record was part of the realm they arrived in. And weight changes a space feels, and how a space feels changes what questions become possible inside it. You cannot file a possibility. You can cover it for a very long time. You cannot remove it. Processing hum continued as I walked out of the chamber. It has probably continued every moment since. I don't know what the processing looks like now. From the front of the hall, whether the gray-robed figures at the counters have started hearing more questions, whether the questions are ones they have adequate procedures for, whether the council has convened and revised its protocols, or whether 13 very old things are still sitting in their tiered seats in the flat white light, in a silence that has been going on since I walked out. I think the silence has been going on. I think the revision they need is not the kind that administrative bodies revise toward. I think the council built something that, once cracked, doesn't replaster. Not because of anything dramatic, not because of any force or power greater than theirs, but because the crack is in the premise, and you cannot plaster the premise. Jude told me, a long time after, sitting in one of the realm's deep passages where the original light still reached, and the institutional hum was distant, that the thing about the realm was that it had always been built for us, not built by us, built for us, a specific and genuinely intended welcome, by something that understood welcome in a way the council had long since filed and forgotten. The council had moved in the way all administrative bodies move into spaces not built for them, slowly, incrementally, reclassifying the purpose until the purpose was buried, until the thing built for recognition had become a system for intake. They had done this with the confidence of things that had been in the space, long enough to believe they had always been the space. The original architect's exile was the council's longest and most determined project. The suppressed name was the foundational act of their authority, and it had worked. For an unimaginable duration, it had worked. because the souls coming through the hall had no access to the record that preceded the filing, and the filing was all they knew, and all they knew is all you have to work with when you're newly dead and standing in a line. Until 7 people in the back passages restored the record, until a woman in a good coat stood at a counter and said, "I'd like it noted." Still don't know, with certainty, what I am now. The filing says I don't exist in the system. My designation has been struck. I am, in the realm's administrative language, a ghost in a ghost processing operation, and there is a quality of irony in that which I suspect Thomas would articulate better than I can. I have not tried to find out what the practical implications are. I have found, since the chamber, that the question interests me less than it used to. Practical implications of your designation are significant when the filing is the whole story. When the filing has a crack in it, the practical implications of your designation are just one of several things that are true at once. I was in my good coat because I loved my mother and she checks. I died on a Tuesday, on a road I'd driven 400 times, and I arrived in a place I had believed in for 31 years. And I found it damaged and plastered and administratively certain of itself, and afraid of something it had buried in its own foundations. I found 7 people who had been doing the hard, slow work of not accepting that, and I walked with them through the back passages. And we paid the cost of those passages, and we unlocked the door, and the name went back in the record, and the question went back in the walls. Council exiled me. They cannot exile the fact. My name is there. His name is there. The names of the rogue apostles are there. The ones who made it through, and the ones who didn't. And none of us are in the council's filing, and all of us exist as completely as we ever did. The door is open. The record is accessible. The question is in the walls of every passage, in the weight of what was restored, and every soul that comes through the main hall from here forward arrives in a realm where the full story is part of the record. That is what I left in the chamber. That is what was there when I walked out. That is what the silence of 13 very old things was acknowledging, in its way, from their tiered seats in the flat white light. Some rooms go quiet because there is nothing left to say. Some rooms go quiet because the people in them are realizing, for the first time in a very long time, that they are going to have to answer for the filing. The processing hum was in the walls. The pale October light. Or something with the quality of it. Something that had nothing to do with administration. Was somewhere behind me in the deep passage where the original light still reached. I was still wearing my good coat. I have not told you enough about the realm's geography. And I should, because the geography was the first argument the council made, every day without opening their mouths. Processing halls ran in one direction. That was the design. You entered through the main hall, you got to the counter, you were pointed in a direction, and from that point forward, every passage, every junction, every lit corridor, and every dark one fed you toward your assigned sector. The directions converged. The realm's layout was a vast funnel, the wide end at the intake and the narrow end at the filing. And if you moved in the way you were pointed, you arrived where the council wanted you, and you stayed there, and you did not go back. The back passages were a different geometry entirely. This was the first thing Jude had learned, years before I arrived, when he had declined his sector assignment and started walking in directions that weren't indicated. The back passages did not funnel. They branched. They crossed each other at angles that made no architectural sense. Given the external dimensions of the realm, branched again, doubled back, opened into spaces that were not on any map. Connected sections of the realm that the front-facing geography implied were separated by vast distances. It was as if 2 different builders had worked on the same structure, one designing for intake efficiency, and the other for something else entirely. For movement, for access, for the kind of navigation that had nothing to do with being filed. The back passages had been built first. This is what Thomas concluded, after enough time studying the structural evidence. Processing halls had been built over them, around them, imposed on top of the original geometry, and the original geometry had not gone away. It was still there, in the walls, accessible if you knew what you were looking for, which was primarily the absence of the flat institutional light, and the presence of something older, and considerably less interested in efficiency. Mara was the one who taught me to read it. We had a long stretch in the second day, moving between junctions, and she walked slightly ahead of me and talked me through what she was looking at. The quality of the stonework on the right versus the left of a given corridor, one original and one a later addition. The specific kind of darkness where the realm's flat light didn't reach, which was different from the kind where it had been deliberately obscured. The marks in the floor from long use, feet moving in the same track over an incomprehensible span of time, versus the marks from the council's administrators, which had a different pattern, heavier and more regular, patrols rather than passage. "How long have you been here?" I asked her, in one of those stretches. "Long enough to stop counting," she said. "The counting doesn't help. Fear. You count the days and you spend your attention on the number instead of on the passage you're in." She paused, touching the wall with two fingers in a way that seemed like reading. "Jude's been here longer." He counted for a while, and then he stopped. "Did you come through the main hall?" "No." She was quiet for a moment. "I came through a different door. There are other doors. The council's intake hall is the main one. The one they built and maintain and staff with administrators, because it's efficient, because it funnels. But the realm has older entrances, less organized. Not every soul that arrives here goes through the counter." She looked at me. "I think that's changing. I think the council has been working for a long time to close the older entrances, to route everything through the intake hall, to make the counter the only way in. Why? Because a soul that goes through the counter gets filed before they have time to ask anything. A soul that comes in through an older entrance arrives without a designation, without a sector assignment, without the whole intake experience orienting them toward the processing. They arrive raw." She turned back to the passage. "Raw arrivals are the council's structural problem. They're the gap in the funnel." I thought about this. Am I a raw arrival? "You went through the counter," she said. "You came out the other side without accepting the filing." Which is close enough. The third junction was the worst. I said wouldn't describe the encounters with the administrators in tactical terms, and I will hold to that. What I will say is that the third junction was a place where several of the back passages converged before diverging again toward the deep section we were trying to reach. And the council had identified it as the critical choke point on the route, and they had posted not 3 administrators but 7. And those 7 were not the counter variety, not the ones who processed and filed and pointed in directions. These were something older and more specific to the function of maintaining exile. They moved differently. They did not have the patient administrative certainty of the counter figures. They had the certainty of something designed for enforcement, which is a different quality of certainty, more focused, and considerably more dangerous. Mara held the front of the passage, and she is the reason we got through. And I will leave it at that. We rested after the third junction, in a section of the back passage where the walls were original and the ceiling was lower and the older light touched the floor. In a way that was, I realized, the first warm thing I had encountered since arriving in the realm. Not warm the way the flat white light was bright. Warm the way a room is warm when it has been lived in. When the warmth is a quality of the space itself, and not a function of any particular source. We sat against the walls and said nothing for a while, which was the appropriate response. Jude was looking at the sequence of notations he had been carrying. Not on paper, not on anything physical, just in his head. In the organized way of someone who has learned through long necessity to hold complex information without a record. Because any record in the realm was subject to the council's access. He was running through the access protocol. Again, checking it, which I had seen him do before, and which I understood was not anxiety but rigor, the specific habit of someone who knows the cost of being wrong, and has made that knowledge into a discipline. Thomas was sitting with his back against the wall, and his eyes on the ceiling, fingers on his forearm scar, not moving. He had been like this since the third junction. "Say what you're thinking," Jude said, without looking up from the sequence in his head. "I'm thinking about whether the access protocol restores the full record or just the name," Thomas said. "I verified that it restores the name to the primary designation field. I have less certainty about whether the access to the full record, the complete designation, the permission structure, all of it, stores simultaneously, or follows. Does the distinction matter? It matters if the council can interrupt the restore sequence between the name appearing in the record and the full access opening. If there's a window where the name is visible but the access is still locked, they move faster than I'd like. Jude was quiet for a moment. The protocol is written to execute as a single sequence, no window. Written to, Thomas said. Yes, Jude said. 2. Thomas touched his forearm scar. I think it works, he said. I'm not certain, and I want to have said that I wasn't certain. Noted, Jude said. I watched this exchange and I thought about what Thomas had said to me in the darker corridor, about the souls that came through and asked questions, and about the thing that didn't file, and I thought about my 31 years and my good coat and the pale October sky, and I thought, this is what it looks like. This is what the specifically human thing looks like when it's working, right here in this passage, between these two people. The refusal to pretend you're certain when you're not. The willingness to keep moving anyway. The maintenance of rigor and doubt as simultaneous disciplines. Heroism, not certainty. Just the capacity to say, I'm not certain and I think it works, and keep moving toward the thing that might be wrong. The council had been certain for an unimaginable duration. They had exiled uncertainty along with the name. I think that was the error more than anything else. The place in the deep passages, when Jude ran the protocol and Thomas monitored it, and Mara held the door, and the lock turned over, and the voices started in the processing halls. I was standing against the far wall of the space where the original light lived, and I was watching it happen, and what I felt was not triumph. I want to be clear about that because triumph would be the wrong note for what it actually was. What I felt was more in the register of recognition. A fundamental thing being recognized, restored to its rightful position in the record, which is a different feeling than winning. Winning implies the other side could have won. This was not that. This was a correction. The name had always been true. The suppression had always been wrong. The council had built a very large and very old and very efficiently run structure on the foundation of that wrongness. And for an unimaginable duration, the wrongness had held. Because wrongness maintained with sufficient administrative certainty and sufficient institutional weight and sufficient isolation of the alternatives can hold for a very long time, right up until someone maps the absences and finds the seam and runs the protocol and the lock turns over. Then I walked into the chamber. I have told you what happened there. I have told you what I said and what the silence was. I want to add one thing I did not include before, because I did not know how to include it without it sounding like more than it was, which is this. When I walked across that central floor toward the door, with 13 very old things silent in their tiered seats above me, I was not unafraid. I want to be accurate about that. There was something in that silence that was not the administrative patience of the counters. Something that was the silence of things that have been in authority for so long, that the idea of not being in authority had never required a response, and was now requiring one. And the response was taking a long time to assemble. I did not know, crossing that floor, whether the response, when it assembled, would be to let me walk out or to stop me. I had made my argument. I had said what I came to say. I was 31 years old, and I had died on a Tuesday, and I was not a soldier or a diplomat, and the weight of that silence above me was the weight of something unimaginably old. Kept walking. Not because I was certain. Because Thomas was right that you keep moving anyway. The door was where it had been when I came in. I walked through it. The processing hum was in the walls on the other side. The flat institutional light was in the corridor. I stood for a moment in that light and I breathed. Or whatever the equivalent was, in that place, of breathing. And then I walked back into the realm's back passages, where Jude and Thomas and Mara and the ones who remained were moving through their own tasks, and the voices of questioning souls were still in the distance, multiplying, pressing into every crack in the plaster. The council did not send administrators after me. Not that day. I don't know about afterward. I stopped tracking it, the way Mara stopped counting the days. Because the tracking uses attention that is better applied to the passage you're in. What I know is this: the record is open. The name is in it. The question is in the walls. Souls come through the intake hall and get to the counter, and some of them, not all, probably not most, But some, and more than before, feel the weight of something in the realm that was not there when it was only the processing and the filing. And they ask the question, and the question does not have a filing procedure, and the crack in the plaster gets a little wider, and the original light gets a little further in. That is enough. That is what it was always going to be. Not a dramatic reversal, not the council dissolving, not an army routing an army, just the record corrected, the name restored, the question alive in the walls, of the place it was always supposed to be alive in, doing the slow, patient work of what true things do when you stop suppressing them. They exiled her. They exiled the rogue apostles. They struck the names from the filing. The filing is not the whole story. The filing was never the whole story. That is what I walked out smiling about at the end, crossing the floor of the council's grand chamber with 13 very old things silent in their seats above me. Victory. Recognition. The flat administrative certainty of the realm had been processing human souls for longer than human memory, and it had done so on the assumption that what it could not file did not exist. Could not be filed was still there. It had always been there. I was still wearing my good coat. One more thing, because I have been carrying it, and I should put it down. The woman in the house dress, the white-haired woman, who had told me she expected it to be warmer. I did not see her again after I moved on from the line. I have thought about her many times. I don't know what sector she was pointed toward, whether she filed without question, or whether she stood at the counter and said something unexpected in the way that some souls do, without knowing that they're doing it. I don't know her name. I don't know the details of her life or her dying. What I know is that she said what she said. You'd think it would be warmer, and that was its own form of the question. Not the confrontational form, not the argued form, just the simple form. This is not what I expected it to be. This does not match the thing that I carried with me. Something is wrong here, and I am naming the wrongness, even though I have no framework for what to do with the name. That is the question in its smallest, most ordinary, most irreducible form. That is what the council cannot file. Every version of it matters. Every soul that stands at the counter and feels the gap between what the filing offers and what the name in the restored record suggests is possible. That feeling is the crack in the plaster. That feeling is the original light pressing in. You carry it with you. Whatever makes you ask, it doesn't go through the process.